The wind at Livingston Station was cruel that morning. It swept through the timber-framed depot with the sharpness of old judgment and the chill of forgotten winters. The sky stretched wide and blue above the Montana plains, but down on the platform the atmosphere was anything but warm. Amara Wilson stood in the middle of it all. She wore a cream-colored coat over a deep emerald dress, one that hugged her frame modestly, the kind you wore when meeting a man you hoped would be kind. Her locks were tied into a low chignon, a simple gold chain glinting at her throat. Beside her sat a single leather suitcase, worn but polished. She had traveled 2 days by train from Atlanta. 6 months of handwritten letters, 2 phone calls, 1 voice deeper than expected, and 1 promise. I'm looking for someone honest. Simple. Someone real. That's what Harold Pierce had written. He hadn't mentioned that real came with conditions. She spotted him instantly. Harold was tall and broad, face lined from sun and age, dressed in a brown wool coat and tan hat. His posture was stiff as he scanned the departing passengers. When his eyes fell on Amara, they locked for a beat too long. He went pale. Then, slowly, his expression changed. The kind of change that empties a person. "Amara?" he said flatly. She nodded, hand reaching to wave. Harold didn't return the gesture. "You never said you were—" He stopped himself, looked around. Several station attendants, a few other passengers, even the luggage boy had turned their heads. Eyes were watching. Amara's smile faded, but she stood straighter. "You never asked." His jaw tightened. "You should have told me." "I didn't think it mattered." He exhaled sharply. "I can't. I didn't expect this. I don't think this is going to work." The word struck her like a slap. But it wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it, as if she were an error that needed correcting. "I'll cover your return ticket," he added, voice clipped. "You don't need to worry." Amara's voice was low but clear. "I'm not worried, Mr. Pierce, and I don't need a handout. I need honesty, which, clearly, you can't afford." A quiet gasp spread through the small crowd. Harold turned red, then white, then looked away. "Good luck to you," he muttered. Then he walked off, stiff-legged, boots clacking harshly against the wood. Amara stood alone, the air colder now. Humiliation pressed against her skin like frost. No one said a word, until a deep voice cut through the stillness. "That's enough of that." A man stepped forward from the side of the platform, where he'd been leaning against a freight pole, arms crossed, watching. He was tall, rugged, sun-kissed, salt and pepper beard, eyes the color of overcast skies, and the kind of composure that only came from land and loss. His boots were scuffed but clean. His hat sat low, but his voice rang out with unmistakable authority. Amara looked up. The man tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "if it's all right with you, I'd like to offer you a ride and a place to rest, temporarily." Her instinct was suspicion. It had been earned, but there was no pity in his voice, no charity, just respect. "You don't even know me," she said. He offered a half-smile. "I know you were brave enough to show up. That tells me more than enough." She glanced down at her suitcase, then at the empty space Harold had left behind. "I suppose I don't have many options." He nodded. "Name's Alexander Maxwell. Folks call me Alex. Ranch is about 20 minutes from here." Amara lifted her chin. "Then lead the way." And just like that, her story began again. The ride to the ranch was quiet at first. The truck was old but well kept, its interior smelling faintly of tobacco and cedar. The Montana countryside passed in golden stretches, fields kissed by morning light, horses grazing in silence, the sky so large it humbled everything beneath it. "You're a long way from Atlanta," Alex said after a while. She glanced at him. "I thought I was headed toward something." "You were." They drove in silence for a few more minutes. "Harold's not from around here," Alex said. "Moved here a few years back. Not surprised he cracked when faced with someone stronger than he is." Amara smirked. "You think I'm strong? You're not crying, are you?" She turned to the window, blinking hard. "Not yet." "Then yes," he said. Maxwell Ranch sat on a ridge overlooking hundreds of acres of land. The main house was large, rustic, but elegant. Wide porches, deep wood beams, and windows that captured every inch of sky. A stable stood to the east. Beyond it, a small guest house. "That's yours," Alex said, pointing. "It's not much, but it's quiet. Safe. Yours for as long as you need." Amara looked around. "Why are you doing this?" Alex met her eyes. "Because I've known what it feels like to be left standing, and I've seen too many good people pushed out of places they never got the chance to belong in." There was something in his voice. Not pity, not flirtation. Grief. She nodded. "All right, then." That night, Amara lay in a soft bed, the guest house windows open to the sounds of crickets and wind. She'd expected to feel unsettled. Instead, she felt still. And in the morning, she went for a walk. She found the ranch library accidentally, a side room in the main house, lined with old leather-bound volumes and sepia-toned maps. One shelf drew her eye. Land records, titles, deeds. She ran a hand along the spines. Her grandfather had been a historian, and she had inherited not just his curiosity, but his burden. A thick envelope buried deep in her suitcase. Inside it, letters, maps, a notarized deed from 1892, signed by Joseph Freeman, a name tied to her family's bloodline. The deed referenced a 640-acre plot of land, including what was now Livingston's town center. She pulled it from her suitcase that night and laid it out on the table beside Alex's records. The handwriting matched. The survey marks matched. It was real. The town, or at least a huge part of it, had been built on stolen land. Her land. The next few days were quiet but tense. She helped around the ranch, fed the horses, repaired a fence. Alex didn't pry, but he noticed. Her focus, her restlessness. "Got something on your mind?" he asked one evening. Amara laid the deed on the table. Alex read it in silence. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "I need to find the rest," she said. "This is just the start." He nodded slowly. "You'll find it." "I can help." "You don't even know what you're helping with." He smiled faintly. "I've got a feeling it's justice." But not everyone shared his sentiment. Word spread quickly. The black woman who'd been rejected at the station was now staying with Alexander Maxwell, that uppity woman, that outsider. At church, whispers turned to silence when she walked in. At the general store, the cashier refused to meet her eyes. One afternoon, she found a note pinned to the guest house door. "Go back where you belong." She burned it in the fireplace, but she kept the ashes. By the end of the week, The town was buzzing. Someone, maybe Harold, maybe not, had circulated a rumor that Amara was claiming the town was hers, that she was digging up old lies to stir up resentment, that she had plans. At a town committee meeting, Harold stood tall. "She's a fraud," he said, "trying to divide us, exploit us. I've lived here longer than she's been alive. She doesn't belong." Amara was not there to hear it, but she was preparing for what came next. Amara Wilson had been in Montana for 21 days. In that time, she'd experienced more tension than in most of her 31 years in Atlanta, and yet she had never felt more certain she was exactly where she needed to be. The deed sat folded in her coat pocket everywhere she went now, like armor. She had memorized its lines, the date, the signature, the way Joseph Freeman's pen pressed deeply into the parchment, as if he'd known that one day someone would try to erase him. And now it was her turn to make sure they didn't. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. Amara began receiving letters, unsigned, handwritten, cowardly. Some were cruel, others just cold. Why now? It's been over a century. Let it lie. Don't ruin what's peaceful. Peaceful. The town had been built on the theft of a black family's land, while its descendants were written out of every plaque, every registry, every celebration. That wasn't peace. That was silence weaponized. Alexander Maxwell knew what the town was doing. He'd seen it before. Decades earlier, after his wife, Elena, had died during childbirth, the community had mourned her politely. But when rumors had spread about her activism, about her friendships with local native families and black ranch hands, people stopped bringing casseroles to his porch. He'd been alone ever since, until Amara. She reminded him of Elena, not in looks, but in principle, a fire that refused to be contained. But instead of burning things down, it lit the path forward. One evening, he found Amara still in the library at midnight, surrounded by old maps and county archives. "Rest," he said gently. "I can't," she replied. "I found something." She turned the page toward him. It was a 1911 plat map, one that listed the town square as Freeman's Hollow. "And now?" Alex asked. "They call it Jefferson's Crossing," Amara said, "named after the man who bought it for half its value from the probate court after Joseph died, and no one told his children." Alex swore under his breath. Amara closed the book. "I'm going to the courthouse tomorrow." He nodded. "Do you want me with you?" She looked at him. "Yes." The clerk's office was stuffy with old paper and older prejudices. The man behind the desk, Dennis White, was the kind who prided himself on being neutral, which usually meant useless when it counted. When Amara laid out the deed and asked to see land ownership transfers for parcels 9A through 14C, Dennis narrowed his eyes. "Why?" he asked. She didn't blink. "Because it's mine." He opened the files slowly, reluctantly, like a man unsealing a coffin he'd long hoped would stay buried. Sure enough, the paper trail was there. Joseph Freeman, 1892. Void deed, 1910. Signed by a temporary executor, unrelated by blood. And then a resale for 1/5 the land's value. The buyer? Thomas Jefferson Harding, Harold Pierce's great-grandfather. The town began to split down the middle. Some saw Amara as an agitator, an outsider, a disruptor, of peace, but others began to lean in. Mrs. Joan Casey, the retired school teacher, came to her one day in the grocery store. "My daddy used to say your people helped build that church," she whispered, but the names were never carved on the cornerstone. Joan handed her a photograph. Black workers standing beside white men in front of the unfinished church steps. One of the black men looked just like the portrait Amara had of her grandfather's grandfather, Joseph Freeman. Amara's hands trembled. "I don't want thanks," she told Joan. "Just truth." Joan nodded. "That's all we should ever want." Harold wasn't having it. He showed up at Maxwell Ranch uninvited. Amara had just come in from feeding the chickens when she saw him by the main gate, wearing a suit like he was attending court. "You're trespassing," she said. He didn't flinch. "You need to stop this. People are angry. Good people." "Then good people should be better." He stepped closer. "You think this will get you somewhere? You'll always be what you were when you stepped off that train, someone who didn't belong." Amara tilted her head. "And you'll always be the man who flinched at the sight of a black woman with dignity." His mouth twisted. "You're playing with fire." "No," she said. "I am the fire." She turned her back and walked inside. Harold stood at the gate long after she was gone. At the next town council meeting, the room was packed. It was the largest turnout in a decade. Amara stood at the front, calm, unshaken. She wore navy slacks, a white blouse, and her grandfather's pendant, a bronze medallion etched with a tree. In her hand, copies of deeds, maps, photographs, testimony. She spoke clearly, letting every word carry. "For over 100 years, this land has carried a false name," she began. "But land remembers. Documents remember. People may forget, or be taught to forget, but truth stays buried in plain sight." She paused, met Harold's gaze in the crowd. "This is not about revenge. It's about restoration." Gasps murmured when she revealed the legal claim. Stone silence fell when she presented the proof that dozens of town businesses, including Harold's grain store and the land under the firehouse, stood on what had once been Freeman-owned soil. "My family was erased. I am here to write us back in." The room erupted. Some people shouted. Others sat in stunned silence. One man clapped, then another. Soon the room was filled with cautious applause, except Harold, whose face was bone white. He stood, tried to speak, but no sound came, and when he turned to leave, he did so with no one at his side. Outside, the air felt different, as if something had shifted, not fully, but enough. Alex was waiting near the courthouse steps. He didn't say anything. He just opened his arms. Amara walked into them without hesitation. She wasn't crying, but her hands were trembling. "I didn't come here to fight," she whispered. "No," Alex said. "You came here to remember." "And to help others do the same." She looked up at him. "I think I want to stay." He smiled. "Good, because this place needs someone like you." A year had passed since the day Amara Wilson stepped off the train in Montana. 12 months since she had been told, in front of a dozen strangers, that her skin was a mistake, that her presence was a problem, that she did not belong. And now her name was etched in bronze on the front gate of the Freeman Foundation for equity and education. The same land where she had once stood rejected now stood as a symbol of restored history and new beginnings. The former grain store, once owned by Harold Pierce and his family for generations, had been bought in a quiet legal settlement. Harold had tried to hold on, even filed an injunction claiming eminent domain. He lost. The court had ruled in Amara's favor. The original deeds paired with historical evidence and affidavits from residents like Joan Casey left no room for denial. The land was not his. It never had been. The day he packed up, no one came to help. And as he drove off, the sign over the storefront came down. In its place rose a new one, Wilson Freeman Community Library, dedicated to the truth we were never taught. Inside, the first shelf on the left held stories by Black authors, Native poets, immigrant voices, people whose words had once been shelved in darkness. The second shelf held land records, not hidden in dusty basements, but proudly displayed. The old maps, the deeds, the photographs. Joseph Freeman's signature, his portrait, his dignity fully restored. Children sat cross-legged beneath the display on weekends, listening to volunteers read stories about justice, courage, and identity. Amara sat with them often, and when they asked, "Is that your great-grandpa?" she would smile and say, "That's all our great-grandpa in a way." But legacy wasn't enough, not for Amara. She wanted to build. So she did. With the land now legally hers, she established 3 core projects through the Freeman Foundation. An education stipend for every child in the county whose family had been historically excluded from home ownership. A grant program for Black and Indigenous farmers who wanted to return to the land. A truth initiative where local students would conduct oral histories, interviewing elders and preserving the memories that had never been written down. She didn't demand repayment. She didn't seek revenge. She just made it possible for others to rise. And that was what shook the town most of all, because they had expected her to hate. Instead, she healed. Alexander Maxwell had never imagined he would fall in love again. After Elena's death, he had lived with the ache, not fighting it, just accepting it as part of who he had become, until Amara. Her laughter had returned light to his land. Her courage had returned heat to his home. And now they shared everything, the house, the work, the vision. They never married in a church, not in that town. Instead, they stood beneath the cottonwoods behind the ranch, surrounded by neighbors, students, and local families, Black, white, Native, all there not just to witness, but to honor. Amara wore a dark green dress. Alexander wore his old leather boots and his late wife's wedding band on a string in his pocket, not to forget her, but to carry her forward. They said vows barefoot in the grass, and afterward Lily Thompson, one of the students from Amara's school, read a poem. They tried to bury her with silence, but the seed knew better than the soil. Now look, the whole town blooms. Harold Pierce never returned. He moved to Idaho, where he was rarely heard from again. His family name faded from public spaces, but Amara never spoke ill of him, not publicly, not even when asked. Once, at a town meeting, someone said, "You could have destroyed him." She had answered, "Why destroy a man already building his house on sand?" And that was it. The town stopped whispering. they started listening. In the spring, Amara was appointed Director of Education for the county of Gallatin, the first black woman to ever hold the role. She declined the traditional swearing-in ceremony at City Hall. Instead, she held it at the ranch. In a barn full of books and wildflowers, her oath was simple: to teach not what's easy, but what's true. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the library, an older black man with a cane, his hands calloused, his voice cracked from time. He introduced himself as Henry Freeman, great-grandson of Joseph's brother. "I heard what you did," he said, eyes wet. "Our people never thought we'd see someone bring the name back." Amara hugged him. She brought out tea, and they sat for hours. He told her stories she had never heard, of Georgia nights, of train tracks built by hand, of the way Joseph used to hum gospel under his breath when no one was watching. And then he asked the question, was it worth it? All the trouble, all the eyes, all the stares? Amara looked at him and said, yes, because now the next girl who steps off a train here won't have to wonder if she belongs. By autumn, the foundation had launched its first mobile education unit, a refurbished bus-turned-classroom that visited rural areas across the state. On the side of the bus, painted in bold strokes by local students, were the words, "The future belongs to those brave enough to remember." Amara stood beside it at the launch, speaking into a mic before dozens of children. "My family's name was buried," she said, "but roots don't die. They wait." She looked at the sky. "And now we grow." In the evenings, Amara and Alex sat on the porch of their home, drinking warm cider, watching the wind move through the grass like music. Sometimes they talked about policy, about land, about expansion. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Once, as the sun dipped low, Alex reached for her hand. "They rejected you because of your skin," he said quietly, "and still you gave them light." Amara rested her head on his shoulder. "They didn't know what they were rejecting," she whispered. "But now they do." He kissed her hair. "Now they do." In the years that followed, the Freeman Foundation became a model across the country, cited in university studies, replicated in small towns, honored by civil rights groups. But Amara never left Montana. She stayed with her land, her people, her purpose. The train still came into Livingston Station every morning, wheels shrieking over old rails, and some days she went down there and sat on the same bench where she had once been humiliated, not to dwell, but to welcome. And when a young girl, wide-eyed, brown-skinned, suitcase in hand, stepped off once and looked around nervously, Amara stood, smiled, and said, "Welcome, you belong." And in that moment she did, because someone had made space, because someone remembered, because someone like Amara had once stood in that same wind and refused to be blown away.